my dear students. I am happy to post this video during the period of COVID-19. I hope you people are safe at home by following the lockdown rules. Let us go to the topic. Today we are going to see about the carotid sheath and its content. In that, we are going to see in the following headings. They are carotid sheath and its contents like common carotid artery, internal carotid artery, internal jugular vein, and the nerve. These are the things we are going to see today. So this carotid sheath, which is going to enclose all these structures, which are transmitting from thorax to the head and neck, and from head and neck to the thorax. Since this region is flexible, having the extension and the flexion of the cervical region, this vital structure has to be prevented from hinging. So it is having the covering like to hold the arteries and vein intact. So we are having that modification of the carotid sheath. Before getting into the detail, let us revise the deep cervical fascia. Means that is the deep fascia of the neck. So already you know that we are having about 4 layers. That is investing layer, pretracheal layer, prevertebral layer, and carotid sheath. So just as a revise, we will trace all these layers, then we will get into the topic. So this is what you are seeing is the right side of screen, that is right side of the neck, and the left side of the screen is the left side of the neck. So what you are seeing image is the cross sectional view of neck viewing from above. So if you see, we can see the vertebra, that is cervical vertebra. If you trace the spinous process, that is the posterior, below is the posterior of the neck and above is the anterior of the neck. If you trace from the spinous process the green line which encloses the trapezius muscle, then again fuses to form a roof of the posterior triangle, again splits to enclose sternocleidomastoid and fuses at the anterior border of the sternocleidomastoid and joins with the opposite side, that is investing layer of deep cervical fascia. Again we will start from the spinous process, another green line which is enclosing the muscles around the vertebra, that is around the cervical vertebra, that is called as prevertebral layer. Another one, that pink color, what you are seeing is the thyroid gland. The fascia which encloses the thyroid gland is called as pretracheal layer. Now all this layer contribute for the carotid sheath. The structure which is lying in between all these layers are called as the carotid sheath. That is, carotid sheath is contributed by all these 3 components of deep cervical fascia. So with this we will get into the today's topic. So we are going to see under following heading, that is the definition of the carotid sheath, location, formation, extension from where, means what is the proximal and distal attachment, and its content, and the position of the content within it, and the relations. So carotid sheath, it is a tubular condensation of the deep cervical fascia encircling the common carotid artery, internal carotid artery, internal jugular vein, and the vagus nerve. So this is the carotid sheath. It is just a tubular condensation of deep cervical fascia. So this is just a cross-sectional diagram to have an idea before getting into the detail. So green line which is the carotid sheath, and the blue which is the internal jugular vein. Then we are having the common carotid artery and internal carotid artery. At the middle, the external carotid artery emerges out to supply the external area of head and neck region. Then the next diagram, which is the cross sectional view. The previous what we have seen is the longitudinal view. This one is the cross sectional view. We can see the vein, artery and the vagus nerve in between these two, uncovered, enclosed in the carotid sheath. Location, where this carotid sheath is located. The name itself explains that it is present in the carotid triangle. The carotid triangle is the division over the anterior part of the neck, that is between the sternocleidomastoid muscle and posterior belly of digastric and the superior belly of omohyoid muscle. Okay, this triangle is called as carotid triangle, where we can see the carotid artery and carotid sheath. Okay, that's why that triangle is named as carotid triangle. This is the cadaveric view where we can see the carotid triangle. That is, this one is the superior belly of omohyoid. This one is the posterior belly of digastric, and here will be the sternocleidomastoid, which we have removed to show the whole extent of the carotid artery. So here will be the sternocleidomastoid muscle. Formation. How the carotid sheath is formed? It is anteriorly formed by investing layer of deep cervical fascia and pretracheal fascia. Posteriorly, that is contributed by prevertebral fascia. Okay, so posteriorly that is contributed by prevertebral fascia, and anteriorly that is contributed by the pretracheal and investing layer of deep cervical fascia. Whole this forms the carotid sheath. This is the cross sectional view. Already we have seen this diagram. So this one is the anterior, this one is the posterior. So this green line is the carotid sheath, and within it we are having the common carotid artery, internal jugular vein and vagus nerve. Extend. From where it is extending? It is extending from base of the skull, where the internal jugular vein emerges out and extends up to the arch of aorta, which will be merging with or fuses with the tunica adventitia of the arch of aorta. Attachment. Above it is attached to the margin of carotid canal and jugular foramen. This carotid canal is the canal present in the base of the skull. Okay, that is the middle part of the base of the skull, where the internal carotid artery enters into the cranial cavity. Okay, through this carotid canal, internal carotid artery enters into the cranial cavity, and jugular foramen, which is present just in front of the foramen magnum. We will see in the next slide. Okay, where the jugular means, that is internal jugular vein emerges out, means that is which is draining the venous system of cranial cavity, that is continuing as internal jugular vein through the jugular foramen. Okay, that is the proximal attachment. That is the proximal attachment of carotid sheath. Below, it's blends with the tunica adventitia of arch of aorta, means that is up to the mediastinum, up to the superior mediastinum of the thorax. So this is the diagrammatic representation of the carotid sheath, which is enclosing the arteries, and this one is the sternocleidomastoid muscle. So this is internal jugular vein. Okay, so this one is the internal carotid artery. So this one is the carotid sheath enclosing these structures. Okay, this enclosed sheath attaches from the base of the skull to the superior mediastinum. So this is the base of the skull. Okay, means norma basalis. If you see the norma basalis, this one, the big one, is the foramen magnum. Once you zoom it, just I have zoomed for the slide, in front of the, means just lateral anterolateral to the foramen magnum, we can see the two openings. The the okay, the above the slide is anterior. This one is the posterior. So this one is the foramen magnum. Just anterolateral. Okay, just anterolateral to it, we are having two opening. The anterior opening is called as carotid canal. Posterior opening is called as jugular foramen. Through this so this encircled line is the attachment of the carotid sheath, proximal attachment of the carotid sheath. Through this carotid canal, there will be the entry of internal carotid artery into the cranial cavity, and the posterior opening, that is the jugular foramen, which is for the emerging out of the venous drainage of the cranial cavity through the internal jugular vein. Okay, so these two openings are just lying in front of, means that is anterolateral to foramen magnum. Okay, so this carotid artery and internal carotid artery, these are the two arteries. Why only the internal carotid artery, not external carotid artery? Why? Because if you see that carotid sheath, which is extending from the superior mediastinum to the base of the skull, during its course, this external carotid artery just emerges out, means that common carotid artery divides into external carotid artery and internal carotid artery at the level of thyroid cartilage, at the level of thyroid cartilage. At the level of the upper border of the thyroid cartilage, it divides into external carotid and internal carotid artery. So external carotid artery is not a content of carotid sheath. Only the common carotid artery and internal carotid artery are the content of carotid sheath, because the external carotid artery emerges out or pierces out the carotid sheath at the level of thyroid cartilage. So external carotid artery is not a content of carotid sheath. So position of the content. What is this position of this carotid artery? So internal carotid artery and jugular vein. Let us see. So this diagram, this one is just the internal jugular vein, internal carotid artery and the common carotid artery. So these three diagrams are at various levels. Okay, at the various level. So this first one is at the base of the skull. This is at the level of C2. This is at the level of C3. So this one is the anterior, this one is the posterior. So with this diagram, we can identify at the base of the skull, artery is anterior, vein is posterior. At the C2 level, just it twists, okay, twist in such a way that artery is just lateral and the vein is medial. In the case of C3 level, the vein lies medial and artery lies lateral. Okay, this is how there is a twisting arrangement of, okay, that will the artery will be lying in the anterior, then goes lateral, and okay, this is how the twisting of these structures takes place. Relation of the carotid sheath. So if you see the relation, means that is the cross-sectional view of the carotid sheath. Anteriorly we are having ansa cervicalis. Posteriorly we are having sympathetic chain, that is the cervical sympathetic chain and the prevertebral fascia. Prevertebral fascia. These are the relations. This is the another diagram showing the cross sectional of the means relation and the orientation of the vessels within the carotid sheath. Now structure piercing the carotid sheath. What are the structures pierces the carotid sheath? The first we will see already we have seen external carotid artery which pierces the carotid sheath and emerges out to supply the head and neck region. Head and neck region, that is the external carotid artery. And most of the tributaries of internal jugular vein. If you see the internal jugular vein, these are the right and left internal jugular vein. This one is the right internal jugular vein. This one is the left internal jugular vein. If you see that left internal jugular vein is draining into the left subclavian, and right jugular vein is draining into the right subclavian vein. So these are the tributaries. These are the tributaries of internal jugular vein. The first tributary, these are the intracranial part. This is extracranial part. Okay, below that round, that is lying outside the cranial cavity. These are the lying within the internal means cranial cavity. Okay, left sigmoid sinus continues as left internal jugular vein. The right sigmoid sinus continues as right internal jugular vein. Before continuing as the internal jugular vein, it forms the bulb. It forms the bulb around the jugular foramen. At the jugular foramen, the bulb receives the first tributary, that is inferior petrosal sinus. Inferior petrosal sinus. Okay, that is one of the tributary passes along the jugular foramen and drains into the bulb of the internal jugular vein. Then that continues as internal jugular vein. During its course, it receives the tributaries like pharyngeal vein, common facial vein, lingual vein, superior thyroid vein, middle thyroid vein. Okay, these are the veins which are draining into the internal jugular vein by piercing the carotid sheath. At the same time, the tributary means there is a communication between the external jugular vein and internal jugular vein through the communication between the external jugular and internal jugular vein. Okay, this is the communicating vein. Okay, this is also piercing carotid sheath to drain into the internal jugular vein. Okay, now let us see the common carotid artery. Common carotid artery arises from on the right side, it arises from brachiocephalic trunk behind the sternoclavicular joint. The left common carotid artery arises directly from arch of aorta. This is means already you people knowing the arch of aorta, that the first one the brachiocephalic artery, and the second one is the left common carotid artery. The right common carotid artery, brachiocephalic, gives the subclavian. From then the one more branch, right common carotid artery. So which will be means going to the neck, head and neck region, and the left common carotid artery goes to the left side of the head and neck region. Course. In the neck region, both arteries having the similar course on either side. Each artery runs upwards at the level of the upper part of the thyroid cartilage, that is at the intervertebral disc between the C3 and C4, that divides. That common carotid artery divides to give external carotid artery and internal carotid artery. This external carotid artery gives the branches for the head and neck region. Internal carotid artery just enters the intracranial cavity to supply the intracranial cavity and the eyeball. Okay, this is the diagrammatic representation. We can see this. Okay, this one is the common carotid artery of the right side up to the upper part of the thyroid cartilage, divides into external carotid artery and internal carotid artery. Okay, internal carotid artery lies posteromedial, okay, posteromedial to get into the carotid canal. This external carotid artery gives all its branches for the head and neck region and the face and the scalp. Okay, this one is the another diagram. The means to have the different parts. This green one is a common carotid artery. These are the two branches. That is external carotid artery and internal carotid artery. Okay, just to differentiate the common carotid and external and internal carotid artery at the level of the upper border of the thyroid cartilage, then branching takes place. External branches, external carotid artery and internal carotid artery. This internal carotid artery is a principal artery for the brain and eyeball. It origin. It is the terminal branch of common carotid artery at the level of upper border of thyroid cartilage. It runs upwards and reaches the base of skull. Okay, runs upwards medially to reach the base of the skull and passes to the carotid canal at the base of the skull, and it then it is dividing into the further parts. Okay, this internal carotid artery having the further parts like the cervical part, petrous part, cavernous part and cerebral part. Okay, these are the further parts of the internal carotid artery within the cranial cavity. So this one is the internal carotid artery. Okay, this one is the cervical part. This one is the petrous part. This one is the cavernous part. Then supplies the eye. Okay, this one is the whole course of internal carotid artery. This is the another diagrammatic representation. That is the cervical part. Blue color is the cervical part. This one is the carotid canal. Okay, this one is the bony part. Okay, this one is the carotid canal. This one is the petrous part. Okay, within the petrous part of the temporal bone. And this yellow one is within the cavernous sinus. And this one is the para-ophthalmic part. Then gives the ophthalmic branch and to form the circle of Willis, all this branch. Okay, these are the terminal branches of internal carotid artery. Internal jugular vein. It is the largest vein in the head and neck region. It continues from sigmoid sinus. At the base of the skull, the sigmoid sinus passes through the internal jugular vein. So this is the diagrammatic representation of the venous system of intracranial part. Okay, this is the superior sagittal sinus. Okay, already all this have been taught. This is the cavernous sinus. Okay, this is the straight sinus. This is the confluence. Okay, this one is the transverse sinus. Okay, right means left transverse, right transverse. Then that will be continuing as the sigmoid sinus. The sigmoid sinus in turn continues as internal jugular vein. It passes downwards vertically behind the sternal end of clavicle to join with the subclavian vein and opens into the brachiocephalic vein. Internal jugular vein communicates with the external jugular vein through the oblique vein, which pierces the carotid sheath at the level of the neck. So these are the tributaries we have seen, which is piercing the carotid sheath, and also these are the tributaries. This pharyngeal vein, common facial vein, lingual vein, superior thyroid vein and middle thyroid vein. These are the tributaries of internal jugular vein, and the oblique vein, which communicates the external jugular vein with the internal jugular vein. Now we will see the another content, that is the vagus nerve. It is the 10th cranial nerve, which is mixed cranial nerve having both the sensory part and the motor part. It is the longest and most widest cranial nerve. It is the longest and most widest cranial, means thickest. Longest and thickest cranial nerve. It arises from the medulla oblongata. It leaves the cranial cavity, passes through the jugular foramen. Jugular foramen. So jugular, since the jugular foramen is means wide, means larger foramen, okay, that will be transmitting so many structures. One of it is the 10th cranial nerve. So this is the structures at the base of the skull. So this one is the internal jugular vein. This one is the internal carotid artery. So these are the nerves passing through this jugular foramen. Along with the internal jugular vein, there are so many structures. That means that is the vagus nerve passes through that jugular foramen. And the 9th cranial nerve, glossopharyngeal nerve, passes through the jugular foramen. Okay, all these nerves. Okay, 9th and 10th passes through the jugular foramen. And one more nerve, that is the accessory nerve. Okay, accessory nerve, spinal accessory nerve also passes through this foramen. So at the jugular foramen, we can see the internal jugular vein, 9th, 10th and 12th cranial nerve passing through this internal jugular, along with internal jugular vein through the jugular foramen. In front of that, we are having the internal carotid artery, which is entering through the carotid canal into the cranial cavity. Now the what means, what are the questions may arise? Define carotid sheath. State the formation of carotid sheath. The extent and its attachment. Enumerate its content. The course of the common carotid artery. Sometimes the short note on internal jugular vein. What are the applied aspect of it? Mostly the common carotid sheath is not having its specific apply. If any adjacent structures like the enlargement of the lymph node around the deep cervical group of lymph nodes, that may compress. That is the space occupying lesion, means the adjacent structures enlarges and compresses the content of carotid sheath. Rarely the infection of the oral cavity, means that is the dental infection, that may get into the carotid sheath, that may spread into the carotid sheath, which will leads to the extent, means the infection which will spread to the carotid sheath, or there will be a collection of fluid, or the infection can spread through the carotid sheath to the mediastinum. Okay, so these are the applied aspect. Otherwise, there is no specific applied aspect for the carotid sheath. One more thing, that the carotid sheath is attached to the jugular vein and the carotid artery. If there is cut through the carotid sheath, okay, that will leads to air embolism. Why? Because since the carotid sheath is adhered to the tunica adventitia of the vein and the artery, okay, that will leads to the wide opening of cut end of the vessels. Cut end of the vessels will leads to wide open. Because of the wide opening, there will be air embolism. That may leads to air embolism of the vessels. Air embolism. Okay. Thank you. I hope this will be very useful to you people. If you are having any queries, please post to my email ID, which I am giving below. Thank you.